Adam, you had reported on a coalition of intelligence officers from the CIA, NSA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Geospatial Intel Agency, and others, and how they were operating out of a basement at a U.S. military base in Wiesbaden, Germany, under an operation called Task Force Dragon. Tell us about that operation.
So this was set up in around April 2022, shortly after the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And there was a realization right from the beginning when they set up Task Force Dragon that they were going to need to provide, in addition to bullets and mortar shells and later HIMARS rockets, that they would need to provide them with intelligence. And so what happened is policymakers at the White House, at the Director of National Intelligence here in Washington, they basically wrote these rules, which decided what we could share with them. And those rules told the guys in the basement, what they were allowed to find on the battlefield and share with the Ukrainians. And so they would look for command posts, pieces of critical Russian equipment, particular units that were effective. And they'd look through satellite imagery. They'd look through signals intelligence intercepts, other sensors that the U.S. is flying unmanned and manned aircraft over the Black Sea. And then they would send this intelligence to the Ukrainians so they would know where to shoot their ordnance.
And they were doing this work pretty quickly.
Yeah. So basically, they would find the possible targets, and then the goal was to speed up and get it to the Ukrainians as quickly as possible. So at the beginning, it took hours to do this. They'd have their meeting, 2 meetings a day, in which the Ukrainians and the Americans sort of agreed amongst themselves what were the highest priority potential targets. Then they would pass that list down to the fusion center, Intel Fusion Center in the basement, and then they would start to find it. It would take hours and hours. In some cases, it took a day. It depended on what they were searching for, obviously. And then over time, as they got used to this process, it got faster and faster. And what originally was taking hours, in some cases, just took a few minutes.
And every single minute is crucial on the battlefield. So the Americans would find the target, the Ukrainians would destroy it. And in a previous conversation that you and I had, you described this as a struggling marriage, except I'm pretty sure you used the term effed up marriage.
Right.
So how did the breakdown occur?
So early on in 2022, when this is all set up, the Ukrainians were incredibly dependent on us for their intelligence. And so as time went along, as we get into 2023, the Ukrainians began to rely gradually less on our intelligence that we were providing to them from this fusion center. And in 2023, when they had shortages of munitions because of a decision that was taken to basically split their forces and split their munitions, the commander in the South, who was in charge of the most important part of their counteroffensive, he added an additional layer to the process. Now suddenly you had a new step. And because the commander there didn't have the same level of trust. He'd never been to Wiesbaden. He never met these people in person. It was always a disembodied voice on the phone, a general calling him, so often yelling at him, telling him what he thinks he should do. And there was tension in that relationship. So the whole goal of the system that was created was to go from point of interest to shot being taken in as little amount of time as possible. And this process that was added by this general in the South was sending a drone. It had to go through, Russian electronic warfare systems that were trying to interfere with its communication, its ability to navigate. So it added hours, in some cases days, to the process of verifying a target that the Americans had already identified. And you have a situation where the American general is on the phone with that Ukrainian general, basically pleading with him, just take the shot, trust me, it's right. But there was a disconnect there, and that's where kind of personalities really does make a huge difference. And that particular general just didn't have the confidence.
Absolutely, and to see the distrust forming in those critical moments, what a tense moment, but such high stakes. And I want to talk about some of these examples where we did see a mistrust or even a distrust forming from these personalities and these disagreements. I mean, you wrote about how the Ukrainians saw the Americans as holding them back and how the Americans got angry that the Ukrainians took down the Moskva, the prized Russian warship, how there were disagreements over how to hit the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is Putin's prized bridge connecting Crimea to Russia. So many examples of where there were rifts. And you even talk about how General Zaluzhny, who was the armed forces commander, ignored calls of General Mark Milley, our top military officer. Wow. So let's get into how this played out on the battlefield. One of the most important places, it seems, is a southern town called Robotyne. What happened in Robotyne?
So the main goal that was agreed to by that general you mentioned, General Zaluzhny, and basically the Americans, including General Milley, was that the Ukrainians were going to put the bulk of their forces and the bulk of their ammunition, which the Americans and the coalition were providing to them, and aim it south from an area called Zaporizhia in the south down towards Melitopol. And on the way to that place, Melitopol, the goal, was a tiny little village that barely, we're talking about, it's a speck on the map, called Robotyne. And in order to get to Melitopol, they had to go through this town. And the Russians had put in really quite elaborate and difficult defenses, trenches, that made it just extremely difficult and time-consuming and risky for the Ukrainians to advance. The way the Americans fight is overwhelming force at a particular breaking point, and if you push, you're going to take casualties, but you're going to take casualties quick. You're going to take them up front. The Ukrainian style, Soviet style, is more of a slow, grinding advance, not at the single point of advance. Just everybody sort of moves at once, and you take less casualties doing it that way up front. But over time, you take more casualties. And so there was a disagreement at that level, like, how do you fight, right? And the Americans only had just several months, really, from sort of February timeframe until June, and they wanted them to go in May. So basically, they didn't have a tremendous amount of time to try to indoctrinate, train them to fight like the U.S. Army. And so then the issue was, okay, well, what can the Americans provide them that gives them an advantage? And that advantage is basically precision weapons like the HIMARS, which can very precisely hit a target because it's satellite guided, and then intelligence, speedy intelligence. And basically the breakdown occurs while they're approaching the city of Robotyne. And the Americans have intelligence because they're looking at it from satellites, and they can see the Russians have largely pulled out of the city. The general in charge in Wiesbaden at the time, he calls his Ukrainian counterpart, who's in charge of Ukrainian forces, and he says, "There's nobody there. Go, send your men forward." But the Ukrainian general, pauses, and he basically says, "We're getting reports that there's a small platoon. There's some Russians on a hill," and he's not wrong. That was true. The Americans didn't see it. It was too small for the Americans to pay much attention to. And so they checked it on the satellites, and yes, this was true. And the American general is back on the phone with the Ukrainian general, says, okay, it's just a platoon. It's just, 40, 50 Russian soldiers. Why don't you fire at them? Here's the coordinates. But the general said, no, that's not how we're going to do it. I want to verify that there are only that small number of Russian soldiers on the hill. So he has drones sent to the hill. This takes, I don't know, hours and hours and hours, half a day, something like this, to get the drones over there. The drones verify what the American general had already told him, which is it's a small group on the hill. He then takes the shot with the HIMARS, and then the American's like, okay, you hit the target. Now go. Advance, send your forces in. The general said, no, that's not how we're going to do it. We want to verify that we hit it.
Right. You quoted a general who said, "Don't worry about how we found out. Just trust that when you shoot it, it will hit."
Right. So this whole thing hinged on trust. And imagine establishing trust on a battlefield between two armies that one of them is not even there. The Americans are not there. The Ukrainians don't know who these Americans are. It's just a disembodied voice on the other end of a phone or a video conference call that happens, twice a day. From his perspective, I can understand his caution, and certainly his system he employed was very time consuming, but it did reduce Ukrainian casualties, which clearly he made a priority. Whereas the Americans wanted them to be willing to take more casualties, but actually advance more quickly.
There was another example where the Ukrainians didn't trust American intelligence when they were heading toward Kherson. An American general told them to bypass Russian detachments. The Ukrainian general was hesitant.
Right.
Why?
So the Russians were they were evacuating their large formation known as a corps to the east bank or the southern bank of the Dnipro River. And they were trying to get across, and the Ukrainians were supposed to basically attack them before they get across. The idea was that the Americans wanted them to, kill the Russians so they can't fight somewhere else, take their equipment. So what's happening in this case is the Russians are slowly withdrawing, and they're leaving small detachments, to basically slow the Ukrainian advance. And these are, in some cases, just a single tank. And the Americans are seeing all this in Wiesbaden on their screen, right, because they're watching it on satellites. They can see there's only one tank. But the Ukrainians didn't want to fight that Russian force. And so the American general in that case was General Donahue. And he's saying, look, it's just a single tank. Just destroy it or go around it. The Ukrainian is like, how do we know there's not a bigger force over the a little bit further behind it, and we're going to be walking into an ambush? But again, we're not giving the Ukrainians the real-time satellite imagery, so they had to trust that Donahue and the Americans' information was accurate, and there was an absence of that trust in a moment like that, and this just slowed down that 2022 counteroffensive. They still succeeded in reaching the Dnipro River, but if they had moved more quickly, they were supposed to cross the river and then try to make their way to Crimea. But they ran out of equipment. They didn't have enough time. That same issue repeats itself the following year in 2023, but the consequences are much more catastrophic in 2023.
And it must have been really hard for General Donahue, who is the former leader of the elite Delta Force, commander of the 18th Airborne Corps until December of 2024, to see this happen. Should the Americans have shared some of these satellite images?
If you ask me, there was definitely, the Ukrainians were pleading with the Americans. The Ukrainians told me that they said at the very beginning, when they realized how the system was going to work, that the Americans are just going to send them the coordinates of where the Russians are located and not the underlying satellite imagery real time, so they would be able to actually see with their own eyes what the Americans are seeing in Wiesbaden. They said put military advisors on the ground in Ukraine, let them be at the command post sitting next to that general, and then they could open up the laptop and say, look, General, this is why Donahue, later General Agudo, is telling you to do this, but the White House and the Pentagon were really worried about being too involved in the war and being perceived as being too involved in the war, since that would basically provide a talking point to the Russians. It would, potentially result in Russia escalating the conflict, having a justification to attack a NATO country, for example, or maybe maybe some American soldier would get captured on the battlefield. Imagine that, or killed. And so they were reluctant to do that. They didn't want to do that. They don't agree to take that step until kind of it's too late, which is in 2024.
You had also discussed how there was one Ukrainian commander who wanted to verify the intelligence and send out drones, and then that actually became a course of action for other Ukrainian generals. part of the reason for that wasn't even about mistrust. It was about the fact that they lacked resources. And so everything that they used, every man on the ground, was precious. This was at the time when Republicans in Congress were holding up military aid.
Right, which I think is also an issue of trust, because for the Ukrainians, they this was sort of like a wake-up call for them. Like, are the Americans really going to continue to support us? At that moment, they started rationing, their own use of munitions. So imagine, you only have so many munitions, you only have so many men. The Americans are sending you these points of interest, telling you where to shoot this very precious commodity that you have, these munitions. And, you just don't have, you can't afford to miss. You can only, you go from a situation where you can shoot 50%. Let's say the Americans send you 100 points of interest and you shoot at 50 of them, let's say. And now you're in a situation where you're getting that same list of 100 points of interest, but now you're only shooting at 5 of them. And that's because, you have a rationing of the shell. And so in order to avoid any waste, any potential for waste, all the commanders along the front line kind of adopted that very cautious, deliberate policy of the commander that insisted on putting drones overhead. Suddenly that became the norm on the battlefield. So again, Wiesbaden is sending the long lists of points of interest every day. And instead of acting on them, now routinely the Ukrainians are flying their drones to validate them. It became such a problem that Wiesbaden started providing the Ukrainians with recommended flight paths for their drones, so that they would find the point of interest more quickly in order to speed up the process. Basically the big advantage that the Americans provided the Ukrainians, it was two of them really. One was precision with the munition. Second was speed, and that's what allowed the Ukrainians to make up for the lack of them being a smaller army than the Russians. So they had fewer men, they had fewer munitions, they had fewer pieces of equipment, but they had precision and they had speed, which the Russians didn't have. But now the Ukrainians, because of their insistence on using drones to verify every piece of American intelligence, they still, I guess, had the precision, but they no longer had the speed. And that was debilitating for them. It slowed everything down.
And if the Ukrainians hadn't verified every piece of intelligence at this point, how differently could the war have gone?
I think it's really hard to know. I mean, if you ask me what the biggest factor was in why they were not as successful as they could have been in 2023, which was the critical year, it was because of the decision that they made to divide their resources between fighting in the northeast, in the east, towards a city called Bakhmut, and employing tremendous amount of men and ammunition for that fight, instead of concentrating their forces in the south in the direction of Melitopol, which was the agreed plan that the Ukrainians did not follow. And so you add that decision to basically split the ammo, split the men that are fighting, and you combine that with the slowdown in the use of the intelligence because of a combination of distrust, and the bar gets raised for every strike because you don't have as many munitions as they were counting on. Those factors together, I think, help explain, why the Ukrainians were not as successful as they might have otherwise been.
Yes, it seemed as though things really started to go awry with the battle for Bakhmut when General Syrskyi, who was then a subordinate to General Zaluzny, but is now the commander of the armed forces, when he insisted on drawing resources into that battle. And there ended up being a three-pronged approach as opposed to a two-pronged approach that the Americans had recommended. What did it do to the American side of the relationship when they find out quite suddenly that the Ukrainians now have 3 targets?
Well, the Ukrainians didn't even tell them initially. The Americans saw on the satellites, because they're tracking where the HIMARS are, where the units are, that are supposed to be in position to launch the counteroffensive in the agreed way, because it was war-gamed in Wiesbaden together by the Ukrainians and the Americans and the Brits. and they see on their satellites that, why are all these HIMARS why are an equal number of HIMARS batteries heading to Bakhmut instead of 75% of them or 80% of them heading down to Melitopol? Why are all these weapons all these shells that we've been sending you, why are they being moved up to Bakhmut instead of being moved down to Melitopol? And so they notice this. The Ukrainians don't inform the Americans. And only once the Americans see it on their screen and they start asking the question, what's going on here? They basically prompt a meeting on the border where Zaluzhny brings these maps and he shows General Kavoli, who's the commander of all American forces in Europe, and he basically shows him on the map what the new plan is. And, Kavoli's response is, that's not the plan. That's not what we agreed to. And General Gudo, who's with him, says something to the effect of, do you think you could do all that with this stuff that we gave you? Because we didn't plan for a three-pronged attack. They planned for a single dominant thrust down to Melitopol with a fake attack in the east around Bakhmut to just make the Russians think that it might be the attack. The whole goal of the Bakhmut, from the American perspective and Zaluzhny's perspective, was to basically lock Russian forces down in the east so they couldn't go down south and then thrust down towards Melitopol. But the Ukrainians ripped up the plan. What was going on, the Americans had hints of this, but they didn't understand how grave it was. But there was really a rivalry between these two Ukrainian generals. And the top general, Zaluzhny, whom the Americans made all these agreements with, didn't have it turned out, didn't have kind of the authority to deliver on his commitments that he made to the Americans. Because Syrskyi had the ear of the president, Zelensky. And General Syrskyi, who's very competent, very smart general, he truly believed in his heart of hearts that that Bakhmut was more important. And who's to say I'm not qualified to say if he's right or who was right and who's wrong. But the plan was to do Melitopol, and he insisted that Bakhmut was more important. And then Syrskyi made a series of decisions, and he took a series of steps with Zelensky's support that complicated the ability of the Ukrainians to be successful in the main effort towards Melitopol. He refused to send brigades that were battle-hardened in the east to Europe to be trained by the Americans and the Brits to fight in the direction of Melitopol. And he basically told the Americans, take all new guys. And so that when these guys showed up, they're in their 40s and 50s. Most of them have never held a gun before. And those are the ones that were sent to be trained. So right from that moment, there were these warning signs that Syrskyi was sort of in the way. His singular laser focus on that fight in Bakhmut, for right or wrong, was getting in the way of being able to effectively carry out the main agreed campaign down to Melitopol.
And you had reported that Biden officials would sometimes joke that they knew more about what the Russians were planning by spying on them than they knew about what the Ukrainians were planning.
By talking to them and spying on them. So, yes, this is to me, this was actually a dynamic that I found fascinating. I used to be based in Israel, and I used to do a lot of reporting on the relationship between the US intelligence agencies and the Israeli intelligence agencies. And there's a tension there. There's definitely a tension there. The Israelis don't always do what the Americans want them to do. But there's so much sharing of intelligence, like automatic, at the working level. So whatever the NSA is sweeping up, whatever the Israeli signals intelligence agencies sweeping up, they're automatically passing this to each other. And but on the Ukrainian side, it's a very different kind of relationship. It's one where the Americans have all this very valuable intelligence. They're passing it to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are very reluctant to share. Now, some of that is understandable. They're fighting for their country. They're fighting for their lives. and they're afraid of leaks, that could damage, their offensives. And there were many big leaks. I don't know if you remember the Discord leaks.
Oh, yeah.
So you had some of the details about what they were working on were being leaked on the American side.
Jack Teixeira.
Yeah. And so, if you're the Ukrainians, and you're fighting that life and death battle, how transparent can you be if you aren't 100% sure that the Americans aren't going to basically compromise a secret operation? At the same time, they also knew the Americans were very risk averse in the sense that they didn't want a war with Russia. They didn't want the United States or NATO get pulled into the war.
And of course, President Biden ended up moving his red lines, allowing the Ukrainians to use U.S. weapons to hit deep into Russia after the United States elected President Trump. You had also described personality clashes.
Yeah.
President Zelensky had a competitive relationship with General Zaluzhny. Zaluzhny and Syrskyi sometimes seemed to have their own clashes. So let's talk about some of those.
Yeah, so, this is one of the most difficult things that the United States faces in any country is like understanding the internal politics, the internal dynamics. And so, there were various rivalries that the Americans were generally aware of, but didn't quite understand how grave they were and how they would impact things. So in our system, in the American system, you have a unity of command from the president, at least it's supposed to have this unity of command all the way down. And we tend to mirror image when we go to other countries. We think, oh, their system is going to be like our system. The Americans really couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that it's not the way it worked in the Ukrainian system. Zaluzhny did make a commitment, and he did want to follow the plan that he worked on with the Americans. But he had this rivalry with the president. Zaluzhny was very popular in Ukraine, extremely popular. If there
Too
was
popular, according to Zelensky, according to sources that spoke with me.
Right. So the fear of Zelensky is he's going to be upstaged. He's potentially going to lose a future election to Zaluzhny. And obviously, if I were the president of Ukraine, I would not be approaching it this way.
That was my next question to you. If you were the president of Ukraine.
If I was the president of Ukraine, you gotta, there are some things, in my opinion, maybe I'm naive, that are more important than, remaining in power, like winning the war.
You had also described disagreements between American generals in Washington and in Europe.
Yeah. So, obviously the Americans who are in Wiesbaden, they're not sitting with them side by side in Wiesbaden, then they're on the phone with them twice a day, doing these video conference calls. They know how hard the Ukrainians are fighting. They see what they're going through, and they want to lean forward. It's a classic, clientitis, they might call it. And the generals in charge in Wiesbaden were always advocating and pushing their bosses at the Pentagon, to give Ukraine priority, to send more equipment. And of course, the bosses at the Pentagon, they were saying no in Washington, and then the Americans in Europe are the ones that then have to tell their Ukrainian counterparts who sorry, but we're not going to be able to do that for you, which I'm sure you can appreciate, didn't make the relationship any easier. And they were the face that the Ukrainians had to plead with. How come you're not going to give us that? This is the key to us succeeding. It's going to save Ukrainian lives. It's going to help us be more successful. And the American generals in Europe completely agreed, but they follow their orders. And the American generals in Europe completely agreed, but they follow their orders, and they can't just raid the cupboard and take all the goodies and all the long range systems and give them to the Ukrainians if the bosses at the Pentagon and at the White House are saying, no, if we do that, we're not going to be ready to fight China. We're not going to be ready to fight the Iranians. We're not going to be able to support Israel or our other partners if they're attacked.
But you had also documented how the CIA had formed a really close relationship with Ukrainian military intelligence back in 2014 when Russia first invaded Ukraine. And I want to talk for a moment about how strong those personal bonds were and how that mattered over time, how that led to success on the battlefield.
Right. Those bonds were forged after Putin and Russia seized Crimea and started rebellion in the east of Ukraine in the Donbas region. And again, very personality driven. You had basically, three key Ukrainian intelligence officers, intelligence professionals, who right from the beginning realized that they needed to have a partner. The Russians were now the enemy, and they couldn't stand up to the Russians without help. And they basically reached out to two services, principally the CIA and MI6, the British, and it became sort of a three-way partnership. Initially, the Americans and the Brits were very worried about working with the Ukrainians because they had been partners with the Russians. The Americans and the Brits had very good reason to be cautious initially because of the risk of penetration. And so what if the Russians, basically everything they gave to the Ukrainians to fight the Russians were getting too. It's like giving it to the Ukrainians, like giving it to the Russians. That's the way the CIA and MI6 thought initially. And so in order for basically that partnership to advance, to grow, the Ukrainians had to deal with this threat, the insider threat posed by Russian spies in their system. And so that took time. That took a year at the SBU. It took time to build that confidence. And then the CIA got permission to start training as well. And we had basically what's known as members of the ground department, which is the paramilitary wing of the CIA. They start to send teams, small teams, to Ukraine to train the Ukrainian services. So they're basically slowly building them up in that period between 2014. Initially, it starts off with like literally clean cell phones, which I'm sure the CIA bugged, and printers, fax machines, which I'm sure the CIA bugged, and gave to the Ukrainians to replace all the equipment that the KGB had given them, and now the partnership was with the United States, and it advanced from equipment like that to eventually, spy gear, that the Ukrainians could use to eavesdrop on Russian communications. Now, the deal that the CIA cut when they did that in 2016 is they said, okay, we will build listening posts. We will provide you with equipment. We will send our experts to Ukraine to help you build these listening posts to spy on Russia. But there's a catch. Whatever you collect, you have to give to us. And that's what they did. And so all of this collection that the Ukrainians it has a long border with Russia. Some of the communities on that border are tiny, right? They're little villages along the border. It's a perfect place to send in human spies. The CIA and MI6 realized that it was a gold mine, the relationship with Ukraine. The Russians are not stupid. They have excellent intelligence inside of Ukraine in that period. I don't know if they know how much they know in terms of the details of the partnership that the CIA and MI6 are having, but they are realizing that it is growing. In the fall of 2021, before the full-scale invasion, the head of the FSB, the Russian intelligence service, briefs Putin, and he says, this is not the exact wording, but effectively he said, the CIA and MI6, they are taking control in Kyiv. And if we don't do something about it, they're going to bleed us from Ukraine for a long time to come. And this was a warning by basically Putin's spy master to Putin, saying the CIA and MI6 are all over Ukraine. They're not wrong. That was one of the factors that played in that had influence on Putin, that I'm told, that had influence on Putin's decision making in deciding whether or not to pull the trigger on this large scale invasion.
So the relationship between the CIA and Ukrainian intelligence might have been part of the reason why Putin decided to invade across the country in 2022.
Yeah, Ukraine might not be getting into NATO soon, but they really want to be part of the West. They see their partnership as the West, not Russia. And for Putin, realizing that he sees Ukraine as so critical, and this is before Putin, the Soviet leaders, had the same view of Ukraine. Like, they can't afford to lose Ukraine. Of all the republics, of all the former Soviet republics, none was more central to Russia than Ukraine, right? And
right. Ukraine is the little brother.
yeah.
Putin sees the fall of the Soviet Union as being a great tragedy. Let's restore Russia to its former greatness. Let's fast forward to when President Trump imposed a pause on both the military aid and the intelligence. It's my understanding that the Ukrainians turned to MI6, but what did the effect have of pausing the intelligence for Ukrainians on the battlefield?
Well, they were basically blinded, for a period of time. It underlined to them how dependent they really were on the United States. They really depend on the American real-time satellite data, which they have satellites, they have commercial data, which they get from satellites, but it's not real time, and in order for them to fight and to know what the Russians are planning, they really are dependent on the United States, to a lesser degree the British, but certainly the British are very helpful to them. And, to shut off that sharing of intelligence was basically a way to send the message that you better fall in line.
And what I've been told is that if there was an intelligence pause, say in 2022 or 2023 in the early days, that would have been catastrophic. But the Ukrainians have developed enough to have been able to manage for that week of the pause after Trump and Zelensky had that implosion at the Oval Office.
Yeah. No, they knew what was coming, right? So they knew what was happening. There was not a lot of movement on the battlefield in the most critical area in the east. So it could have been a lot worse, for sure. If it had been protracted, it would have been a lot worse. And what ended it was a meeting Rubio has in Saudi Arabia with the Ukrainian side. Well, I'm not sure who the audience really was for that pause. If it was, the American public audience, Trump supporters saying, look, he can get tough with the Ukrainians. Certainly the Ukrainians, were devastated. Not that it, again, was so catastrophic, but just, it reinforced in their minds that we're not a reliable partner.
Now Trump's minerals deal has been signed, and it appears to be beneficial to both sides. How do you see the relationship moving forward?
Yeah, honestly, I think, the minerals deal, as best I can tell, is largely symbolizing a long-term relationship, but not the kind of relationship that the Ukrainians are really need, which is long-term military support, right, and intelligence support. And so we don't know where that stands. By the time they actually pull any minerals out of the ground, Donald Trump will probably not be president anymore. It's a very long time to get something like that going.
Right. On whose side is time?
Yeah.
So you took multiple trips to Ukraine to report this story. You met with so many officials, and you had to develop trust in a story about the breakdown of trust.
Right.
How did this story start off? And tell me what it was like to be on the ground.
Yeah. So, I did probably 6-7 trips to Ukraine for this project. It all started when I was having drinks with a source in Washington who basically said, one of the big surprises is how the techniques that were honed by special forces units like Delta in the war on terrorism, fighting in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, how those techniques, which is like using social media data from social media posts, intercepted phone calls, satellite imagery, this kind of fusing of all this intelligence to enable those operations against terrorist leaders, that it was proving very useful on the battlefield of Ukraine. And I didn't understand what the person was talking about. And
how many drinks were we talking about?
It wasn't. I wasn't overdoing it, but it gave me sort of the kernel of something that I thought sounded fascinating, because at that point, and to this day, the Pentagon has been pretty transparent about the pieces of equipment, types of equipment that it's giving in quantities that they're providing to the Ukrainians. But when it came to intelligence support, it was all being obscured by just, yes, we provide them with intelligence support, but very little information about, like, what does that mean? several of my sources here had recommended I meet with a particular Ukrainian general, General Zabrodsky, who had spent time in the United States and spoke very good English and sort of was acting as sort of the main Ukrainian liaison to the Americans. He was sort of the heart of this partnership, right? And so he agreed to meet with me on the front lines in the south in Zaporizhia. This was August 2023, in the middle of their what would be their failed counteroffensive. And he sent me a pin on WhatsApp, which was like a little village right, about 15 miles or 15 kilometers from the front lines. And so I had a driver. We followed the pin. We ended up in this tiny little village of like little farmhouses. And when I got there, it seemed like it was completely desolate. Then a motorcade comes, and it turns out where he was sleeping at night for that period of time, and that's where we had our first meeting. And yeah, I basically, told him like I wanted to tell the whole story. Could you tell me the story of this partnership? And he's very proud of what, even though it obviously has all these flaws, and as the story explains, like some things worked really great, some things totally didn't work. It was definitely like a messed up marriage, but he was very proud nonetheless of what he was able to personally do in terms of building those relationships with the Americans. I can see why the Americans trusted him. He is just a very I would say inspirational general, and very humble, and very human. And he was able to forge these relationships, and he was very proud of what he was able to do with all the headaches and problems that came with that.
Yeah, and there is reason to be proud. There was a lot of success, and hopefully moving forward there will be success in the future.
Yeah.
Adam, thank you for sharing your reporting with us.
No, it's a pleasure. This is great.